They told them they were going on a seaside vacation, a safe assignment on a tropical island far from the sound of real guns. The Marine Corps generals, still consumed by doubt about the black man's capacity for combat, sent these troops away with shovels and sandbags, hoping they would build a defense line and stay out of trouble. They saw a unit meant for logistical chores. They saw men who were easily forgotten. But they made a fatal mistake. They forgot that every Marine, regardless of skin color, is a weapon. And when a hidden Japanese unit sprang a massive, brutal ambush on this safe deployment, these men fought with a fury that cost them dearly. Their heroism was so undeniable, yet so politically inconvenient, that the Marine Corps did the unthinkable. They took the loss, but they buried the battle. They erased the names, filed away the reports, and locked the story of the 7th Defense Battalion in a vault of military secrecy. Before we dive into the hidden history of the Pacific, I want to know what you believe. This story is about overcoming a conspiracy of silence. Go down to the comments right now and finish this sentence. The biggest lie in American history is. Let's see how much truth we have to uncover together. Sound off below, and let's bring these hidden heroes back into the light. Imagine the reality of the Marine Corps in 1942. The sting of Pearl Harbor was still fresh. America was scrambling to reinforce its Pacific holdings. But the military was battling two enemies, the Empire of Japan and its own crippling segregation. The success of the Montford Point program had forced the Corps to accept black recruits, but the attitude remained rigid. Black men were not fit for the front line. They were to be used as a labor pool. They were sent to build the infrastructure that would allow white units to fight. The men who would form the 7th Marine Defense Battalion were among the earliest recruits to be sworn in. They were promised the title of Marine, the honor of service, and the chance to fight for their country. What they received was a perpetual insult. Their unit was tasked with setting up and maintaining massive coastal artillery guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and setting up communications. A necessary, but decidedly rear echelon role. The implied message was clear. You are here to defend a beach, not to take one. You are here for defense, not offense. The battalion was organized, trained, and shipped out. For the Black Marines, the journey to the Pacific was a psychological gauntlet. They endured the same segregated transport ships as the Montford Point Marines, relegated to the worst quarters, often facing hostility from the white sailors and Marines they were supposed to serve alongside. The military machine was willing to use their bodies, but not yet their souls. Their destination was a remote, heavily forested, and strategically vital island chain that had just been secured by American forces after heavy fighting. They were tasked with setting up a series of permanent defense positions. This was not Iwo Jima or Tarawa. This was a place that was supposedly pacified, far from the main thrust of the island-hopping campaign. The command gave them one specific instruction: establish the perimeter, mount the guns, and expect no trouble. For the young Marines, the assignment felt like a betrayal. They had endured the brutal training, the systemic prejudice, and the long, humiliating voyage across the ocean to get to the war. Now, they were told they were going to sit out the action on a quiet island, a safe haven where the only enemy was boredom and the jungle humidity. They wanted to fight. They wanted to prove themselves. Instead, they were given shovels and told to dig. But the Pacific War was a war of chaos and unpredictability. Pacified was a relative term. The Japanese military doctrine dictated that no unit should ever surrender. On every island the Americans took, thousands of Japanese troops would simply melt into the dense jungle, establishing hidden pockets of resistance, waiting for the opportunity to strike back, or simply waiting to die. The American assumption that the island was secure was a fatal error, born of arrogance and a failure to fully respect the enemy's determination. The 7th Defense Battalion was spread out thinly across the island chain, tasked with clearing jungle, setting up massive gun emplacements, and preparing for counterattacks that their intelligence reports assured them would never come. They were working outside of the main, heavily armed infantry patrols. They were building a fortress, not fighting a war. This left them dangerously exposed, a line of builders armed primarily with tools and only secondarily with rifles. It was during a routine jungle clearing and reconnaissance mission that the first signs of trouble appeared. A small patrol from the 7th Battalion, tasked with charting a remote ravine for a future gun emplacement, failed to report back. A search party was dispatched, and what they found was a cold, professional ambush. The Marines were dead, killed by close-quarters bayonets and silenced rifles, their bodies meticulously hidden beneath a pile of brush. It was a clear, chilling message. The enemy was still here, and they were hunting the support units. The command structure reacted with predictable hesitation. White officers, unfamiliar with the terrain and the psychological warfare of the Japanese, downplayed the incident, labeling it a mere skirmish with stragglers. But the men of the 7th Battalion knew better. The discipline of their training kicked in. They knew they were being watched. They knew they were bait. They started sleeping in shifts, keeping their rifles loaded, and setting up improvised tripwires around their camp. They were prepared for a fight that their generals insisted would never happen. The ambush came under the cover of a massive tropical storm, a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to zero and muffled the sound of approaching troops. A well-organized Japanese unit, emerging from a hidden network of tunnels and caves, launched a concentrated, brutal attack on one of the forward gun emplacements being established by a company of the 7th Battalion. The Black Marines were hit not by disorganized stragglers, but by a coordinated assault designed for annihilation. The objective was simple: kill the crews, spike the guns, and prove that the American interior was vulnerable. The Black Marines found themselves fighting for their lives in the pitch-black, rain-soaked jungle. They were fighting men who were screaming war cries, fighting a close-quarters battle of bayonets and grenades. Their immediate, ferocious response was fueled not by orders, but by the will to survive. They dropped their shovels and seized their rifles, their bodies moving with the disciplined speed drilled into them at Montford Point. They held the line, fighting back against a superior force with a courage born of desperation. The jungle, which was supposed to be their sanctuary, had become their crucible, and they would pay a price that the Marine Corps would try for 70 years to hide. The battle for the forward emplacement was not a fight. It was an act of survival. The Japanese assault force, estimated to be more than twice the size of the company-sized unit from the 7th Defense Battalion, struck with terrifying speed and precision. They emerged from the storm-swept jungle, moving with the deadly silence of trained killers, their objective being the annihilation of the gun crews. The Black Marines found themselves locked in the most brutal form of combat: the close-quarters night ambush. The initial wave of the assault tore into the thin defensive perimeter. Japanese soldiers, screaming banzai charges, poured over the hastily erected defenses. The Black Marines, though shocked, did not break. Their response was immediate and disciplined. They fought with the ferocity of men who understood that surrender was not an option. For them, it meant not just death, but a confirmation of the lie that they were cowards. The air was a maelstrom of sound. The metallic crack of American M1 Garands, the staccato, tearing sound of Japanese machine guns, the screams of the wounded, and the torrential rain that turned the red earth into a slick, deadly soup. The men fought with rifles, with bayonets, with entrenching tools, anything they could grab. They were a defensive unit, trained for artillery, but they were fighting like the most hardened infantry. The fighting was concentrated around the key gun emplacements. A Marine named Private First Class Robert T. Johnson became the center of a desperate defense. His machine gun crew was wiped out by a grenade, yet Johnson, ignoring a deep shrapnel wound to his leg, wrestled the heavy gun out of the muck. He hoisted the water-cooled weapon onto his shoulder and began firing from the hip, walking a curtain of lead into the charging Japanese lines. He fought with an almost suicidal disregard for his own safety, buying his comrades precious minutes to reorganize and hold the line. His action was a supreme act of individual courage, turning a potential rout into a stubborn, bloody stalemate. The battle raged for 3 hours. 3 hours of pure, unadulterated hell in the tropical storm. The Black Marines were fighting for the very ground they stood on, refusing to yield the massive guns they had been ordered to guard. But the weight of the enemy's numbers and the surprise of the attack began to tell. Casualties mounted rapidly. The situation was so desperate that the forward command post, under direct assault, was on the verge of being overrun. Communications were cut. The white officers in the rear, still struggling to comprehend the size of the attack, were slow to dispatch effective reinforcements, believing the reports of heavy enemy contact were exaggerated. The 7th Defense Battalion was fighting this battle alone, isolated in the black heart of the jungle. Finally, just as the Japanese were preparing for a final, decisive banzai charge, the sound of friendly machine guns from a distant perimeter cut through the rain. A small, hastily organized relief force, comprised of other companies from the 7th Battalion who had ignored the sluggish orders of the rear command, had arrived. The sudden reinforcement, a burst of unexpected fire from the flank, was enough to break the enemy's resolve. The Japanese forces, having suffered heavy losses and realizing they had lost the element of surprise, pulled back into the jungle, leaving their dead scattered across the position. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale, weak light over the battlefield, the scene was horrifying. The gun emplacement was a ruin. The red earth was churned into a black mud, littered with bodies and equipment. The Black Marines had held the position, but the cost was staggering. Over 50 men from the company were killed, wounded, or missing. It was a casualty rate that would have broken many veteran infantry units. The reports that came back to the main command post were immediate and contradictory. White officers, who had been skeptical of the black troops' ability to fight, were faced with an undeniable truth. The men had displayed extraordinary courage and discipline under the most extreme pressure. Their defense had saved the massive coastal guns and prevented a catastrophic breach of the island's interior defense line. But the sheer number of the dead and wounded presented the Marine Corps with a massive political problem. This was not a minor skirmish. It was a full-scale battle, and the all-black unit had suffered losses that were disproportionate to their role. The generals knew that if this story reached the headlines back home, a story of a black unit being overwhelmed, having its communications cut, and suffering massive casualties in a supposedly secure area, it would be used as a weapon by both segregationists and civil rights activists. The segregationists would use the high casualty count as proof that the black troops were not fit for combat and were easily routed, ignoring the fact that the unit had fought and won against overwhelming odds. The civil rights activists would use the heavy losses to demand immediate, full integration and an investigation into why a defense unit was left exposed and undersupplied, which the Corps desperately wanted to avoid. The decision was made at the highest level of the Marine Corps command on the island. The battle would be minimized, the casualties concealed, and the heroism suppressed. The official report was deliberately scrubbed of critical details. The ambush was labeled as a mere contact with aggressive stragglers. The true number of the dead was internally classified, and the acts of valor, the actions of men like Private First Class Johnson, were quietly acknowledged on base, but never pushed forward for formal commendation. The Black Marines of the 7th Battalion, who had fought for their lives and won, found themselves victims of a second, more insidious betrayal. They had paid the blood price for their courage, but their country had stolen their glory. Their heroism was deemed a political liability, and their sacrifice was buried in the black mud of a forgotten island. The truth of their defense would be locked away in a filing cabinet for decades, a secret shame the Marine Corps carried while the war raged on. The war for their unit's honor had just begun, and it would last long after the guns of the Pacific fell silent. The official silence that followed the ambush was more devastating than the battle itself. For the surviving men of the 7th Defense Battalion, the lack of acknowledgement was a cold, constant insult that ate away at their morale. They had seen their friends die. They had fought like the most hardened infantrymen. They had saved the massive coastal guns they were sent to protect. Yet, their valor was treated as a bureaucratic inconvenience. The unspoken command from above was clear. Forget what happened. Do not speak of the dead. Do not claim the medals you earned. This suppression created a deep internal chasm within the unit. The Black Marines had proved their worth to themselves and to each other in the crucible of battle, forging an unbreakable bond. But when they looked outside their unit, they saw the same prejudiced military structure that refused to see them as anything more than laborers. They had been denied the right to be heroes. The psychological toll was immense. Men suffered from night terrors, the sounds of the night ambush replaying in their minds, but they were given no counseling, no formal debriefing, and no release. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was decades away from being understood, and for the Black Marines, any sign of weakness or trauma could be interpreted by their white officers as proof of the racist stereotype, that they were unstable or not fit for combat. So they swallowed their fear, their grief, and their rage, carrying the entire emotional weight of the battle in silence. The rest of their tour was a study in paradox. They were moved to another island, continuing their assignment to build defense installations. They were given the worst duties: cleaning latrines, chipping paint, working in the equatorial sun, while white units rotated to the rear for rest and rehabilitation. Yet, every single man performed his duty with a meticulous, defiant excellence. They ran faster, marched straighter, and polished their gear brighter than any unit in the sector. Their discipline was not a sign of subservience. It was an act of controlled, internal rebellion. They were saying, without uttering a word, "You may steal our glory, but you will never steal our competence." The officers and NCOs who had fought with them were faced with their own moral dilemma. The white officers who had seen the battle knew the truth, but their careers depended on maintaining the official narrative. A few tried to push for recognition privately, sending addendums to reports or trying to submit commendations, but their efforts were swiftly and quietly killed by the higher command. The Black NCOs, the core of the unit, became the emotional caretakers of the battalion. They used the story of the ambush not as a tale of victimhood, but as a teaching tool. They reminded the younger Marines, the only thing that matters is the man next to you. The Corps will forget you, but your brother won't. Our honor is our own. As the war progressed and the need for manpower became overwhelming, the institutional barriers began to crack slightly. Some individuals from the 7th Battalion, whose performance during the ambush had been too conspicuous to ignore, were pulled out and assigned to integrated or general service units. For these men, the transfer was a double-edged sword. They were finally entering the real war, but they were leaving their brothers behind and walking into units that were often hostile or openly prejudiced. They had to fight for respect all over again. The war finally ended in August 1945, not with a massive invasion, but with the flash of 2 atomic bombs. The surviving men of the 7th Defense Battalion, their tour finally complete, prepared to return home. They boarded the transport ships, their chests devoid of the medals they had earned, their minds heavy with the memories they were forbidden to share. The journey home was the final, agonizing insult. As the ships approached the American coast, the segregation policy snapped back into rigid place. The brotherhood of the foxhole that they had glimpsed in the dark of the jungle vanished. They were quartered in the worst parts of the ship, denied the use of the upper decks, and treated not as conquering heroes, but as a liability to be contained. When they stepped off the ships in California, the contrast was a physical blow. They had been to the ends of the earth, fought the most brutal war in history, and survived a secret massacre. They returned to the same country where they were barred from a restaurant or forbidden to sit in the front of a bus. The realization that their ultimate sacrifice had not changed the fundamental rules of their homeland was crushing. The ensuing years of Reconstruction and civil rights struggles would be the final, long phase of their battle. The veterans of the 7th Defense Battalion, carrying their secret battle scars and their hidden trauma, returned to their hometowns. Most simply melted back into civilian life, their incredible stories locked away. They did not speak of the jungle ambush. They did not speak of the massive losses. The official silence of the Marine Corps became their own. They knew that telling the truth would only lead to trouble, disbelief, or the confirmation that their lives were indeed valued less than the white Marines. But their service was not in vain. The discipline, the quiet integrity, and the fierce sense of justice they had earned in the Pacific made them natural leaders in the civil rights movement. They became the stern, organized backbone of their communities, the men who taught the next generation how to face violence with discipline and how to fight for dignity without ever dropping their guard. They used the lessons of the jungle, the need for meticulous planning, the power of a coordinated defense, the importance of unbreakable morale, to wage the war for equality at home. The story of the 7th Defense Battalion became a whispered secret, a hidden chapter of Marine Corps history. The Marine Corps, in its desire to promote a seamless narrative of integration, was eager to forget the era where black units were treated as expendable labor. The heroes of the jungle ambush were erased, their names absent from the official rolls of valor. But the truth, as always, had its own memory. And that memory, preserved in the hearts of a few aging men and the musty boxes of forgotten archives, was waiting for the right moment to be brought back into the light. For over half a century, the heroism of the 7th Defense Battalion remained entombed in the mud of a forgotten Pacific island and the sterile filing cabinets of the Marine Corps archives. It was a silence enforced by institutional design. The Marine Corps, having achieved full integration in the 1960s, was eager to present a clean, seamless narrative, a brotherhood forged in fire, with no mention of the segregated past or the political betrayals. The existence of a large-scale concealed battle where a black unit suffered immense, disproportionate losses was a toxic truth that threatened to poison the celebratory narrative of integration. The systematic erasure took a profound toll. Unlike the Tuskegee Airmen, whose existence was a celebrated fact by the 1980s, the story of the 7th Defense Battalion was relegated to the margins. There were no Hollywood movies, no widespread documentaries, and no official curriculum that spoke of their courage. The veterans themselves, bound by the cultural code of stoicism and the practical knowledge that complaining only brought trouble, rarely spoke of the ambush. They lived their lives as quiet heroes, their sacrifice known only by the few remaining men who had shared the rain and the mud of that terrible night. But history has its own method of correcting the record. The truth of the 7th Defense Battalion survived in 3 critical places: the oral histories of the descendants, the fringe scholarship of dedicated academics, and the bureaucratic paper trail the Corps could not destroy. The first source was the most powerful. In black communities across the country, the story of the unnamed island and the brutal silent battle was passed down, often sanitized for the young, but retaining its core message of betrayal and courage. Grandchildren would hear their elderly grandfathers, often suffering from invisible traumas, speak briefly of the worst fight where no one came for us. This oral tradition kept the moral ledger open, a debt that the nation had yet to repay. The second source was the work of a few persistent historians and military researchers, often black scholars, who realized that the official narrative of Marine Corps integration was too tidy. They began cross-referencing military service records, casualty reports, and the archived unit diaries. They noticed the discrepancy: a large, statistically unusual spike in casualties within a defense unit on a pacified island. They realized that the official reports of a contact with stragglers were a deliberate, calculated lie. They began to find the fragmented addendums and suppressed commendation requests, slowly piecing together the full scope of the ambush. The final, undeniable evidence was the bureaucratic trail. While the Corps may have concealed the heroism, they could not fully erase the paperwork. The casualty reports, the ammunition expenditure requests, and the maps detailing the location of the fatal ambush remained locked away. The archival paper trail was the ghost of the battle, waiting to be summoned. The turning point for the 7th Defense Battalion's story arrived in the late 1990s and early 2000s, driven by a national imperative to finally honor all black veterans of World War II. As the veterans of the Montford Point Marines were finally being brought into the light, the attention of military historians naturally turned to other segregated units. The story of the Battle of the Ambush, as some researchers began to call it, was too compelling, too egregious, and too well documented in the deep archives to ignore. A key moment came when the children and grandchildren of the surviving veterans began to actively campaign for their ancestors. They found the researchers. They shared the oral histories. They lent their grandfathers wartime letters and photographs. The mission to restore the honor of the 7th Defense Battalion became a collective campaign, powered by a demand for historical accuracy and moral justice. The pressure mounted on the modern Marine Corps leadership. The Corps prides itself on its motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful, and the discovery of a deliberate, decades-long cover-up involving the sacrifice of an all-black unit was a direct assault on that code. The Corps faced a choice: continue to defend the lie of the past, or embrace the painful truth and integrate it into the institution's proud yet flawed history. The choice was made for truth. The Marine Corps began the slow, formal process of acknowledging the hidden battle. The most significant action was the quiet, formal correction of the record. The official histories were amended. The unit's service was formally reviewed, and the incredible acts of valor performed that night were finally submitted for the commendations they had earned over 70 years prior. For the few surviving veterans of the 7th Defense Battalion, the late recognition was a bittersweet, overwhelming experience. They were old men, frail, and often confined to nursing homes. They had lived their entire adult lives knowing a truth that the world refused to acknowledge. They were finally seeing the light of justice shine upon the deepest scar of their lives. The legacy of the 7th Defense Battalion today is one of defiant resilience. They stand as a permanent lesson that military effectiveness and racial justice are inseparable. Their blood proved that segregation was not only morally wrong, but was also a massive strategic blunder that cost American lives. Their story is a charge to the modern military to never allow political convenience to supersede the mission or the honor of the men who perform it. Ultimately, the men of the 7th Defense Battalion, by enduring the unacknowledged horror of that jungle ambush and living with the silent betrayal of their own corps, gifted us a profound truth. The real measure of a nation's character is not how it celebrates its famous victories, but how it treats the memory of its forgotten heroes. By finally pulling their story out of the mud and the silence, we ensure that the courage they displayed that terrible night will not only be remembered, but will be used as a moral blueprint for a more just and faithful military of the future. The final act of the 7th Defense Battalion's saga is not a simple biography. It is a profound moral indictment and a necessary blueprint for institutional redemption. Their history forces us to confront the fact that military victory, however absolute, is meaningless if the nation's integrity is compromised. The suppression of their story was an act of national self-harm, a denial of American heroism that speaks volumes about the corrosive power of systemic racism. We must analyze the core mechanisms of this betrayal. The cover-up of the ambush was executed by the Marine Corps not out of malice towards the individual Marines, but out of a desperate need to preserve a pre-existing institutional narrative, that of a pure, white, infallible fighting force. The logic was cold. If the public learned that a segregated black unit had been ambushed, suffered massive casualties, and fought with unbelievable valor, it would force two immediate, inconvenient conclusions. First, the black troops were indeed fit for combat, necessitating full integration. Second, the Marine Corps High Command was responsible for a colossal intelligence failure and a deadly lapse in support, which meant white generals were incompetent. The Corps chose to sacrifice the truth and the honor of the black Marines to protect the narrative of white superiority. This reveals a timeless moral. In systems of entrenched injustice, success can be penalized more harshly than failure. The excellence of the 7th Defense Battalion was the primary threat to the established order. Their survival was too heroic, their casualty count too high, and their valor too irrefutable. They were not merely fighting the Japanese. They were fighting the fear that their courage would break the back of segregation. The subsequent institutional silence was not merely neglect, it was a form of psychological violence. The military code demands that a soldier's sacrifice be acknowledged, that the blood paid in battle is honored by the gratitude of the nation. To deny this acknowledgement is to deny the meaning of the soldier's life and death. For decades, the surviving veterans were forced to endure this psychological burden, carrying the trauma of the ambush alongside the trauma of being told their service was insignificant. Their long fight for the correction of the official record was a final, grueling battle for the meaning of their own lives. However, the legacy of the 7th Defense Battalion is ultimately one of moral and professional triumph. The Corps eventually recognized them because the logic of Semper Fidelis ultimately demands truth. The institution, in its own slow, bureaucratic way, had to correct the record to save its own soul. The belated formal honors, the medals, the corrections to the historical texts, the ceremonies, were not merely gifts. They were a return of stolen valor. This act of official repentance, however late, provides a crucial model for how national institutions can and must confront their own histories of injustice. The story serves as a powerful testament to the unique resilience forged in the crucible of segregation. The men of the 7th Defense Battalion had developed an internal toughness that was their greatest asset. They were accustomed to being doubted, to being undersupplied, and to being ignored. When the actual ambush came, they reacted with a discipline born of years of having to be perfect just to survive. Their survival was a testament to the iron will necessary to navigate a society that was fundamentally hostile to them. They were prepared for the ambush because they had been living in a hostile environment their entire lives. Furthermore, the 7th Defense Battalion left an indelible mark on the concept of duty and commitment. Their initial assignment was humiliating, their training harsh, and their reward invisible. Yet, when the true test came, when the Japanese attacked, they fought with a fierce, unwavering dedication to the mission. They proved that commitment to the higher principle of defending the nation transcends the personal insults of the government. They fought for the future of their country, not the present flawed version of it. Their legacy is a perpetual challenge to the modern military. Are we leading based on merit or on historical comfort? The lesson of the 7th Defense Battalion is that true strength lies not in homogeneity, but in meritocracy, in the willingness to accept and promote excellence, regardless of where it comes from. By suppressing the courage of their black Marines, the Corps was weakening itself. By finally embracing their history, the Corps becomes stronger. The final, essential takeaway is the recognition that the battle for history is the battle for the present. The truth of the 7th Defense Battalion's heroism is a weapon for every Black Marine, soldier, sailor, and airman today, proving that their claim to every rank, every command, and every honor is not a request, but a right purchased by the blood of their predecessors. The decades of silence are over. The men who fought in the dark and the mud of that jungle ambush are silent no more. Their story is now a permanent beacon in the firmament of American military history, a solemn and powerful reminder that the greatest heroes are often found not where the cameras are rolling, but where the bureaucracy hoped no one was looking. They are the guardians of the truth, and their honor will now shine as brightly as the gold they were initially denied. We have tracked the 7th Defense Battalion from the insult of their segregated induction to the unacknowledged horror of the jungle ambush, and through the long, silent war for their honor. The final question we must answer is not what they did, but what their story demands of us, the inheritors of their memory, today. Their legacy is a profound treatise on the inherent American paradox, the nation's highest ideals coexisting with its deepest moral failings. The men of the 7th Battalion were forced to prove their humanity against a double standard that was both legally sanctioned and physically enforced. They were told their assignment was to build a fortress, a symbol of American security. In reality, they were building the ultimate moral argument for the American conscience. Their blood, shed on that remote Pacific island, serves as a permanent, ironclad amendment. Amendment to the concept of the American warrior. Valor is not exclusive. The denial of valor is a choice. The most significant takeaway from their prolonged silence is the understanding of institutional accountability. The Marine Corps did not suppress the truth of the ambush because it was embarrassed by the Marines' performance. It suppressed the truth because it was terrified of the implications of their excellence. Their success would have exposed the cowardice and incompetence of the high command that chose to leave them isolated. The decades of silence were not an oversight. They were a systemic effort to protect the careers of white officers and the institutional narrative of racial exclusion. The heroes of the 7th Defense Battalion teach us that the struggle for justice often involves two distinct phases of warfare. The first phase is the war of blood, fought with rifles and grit, where victory is measured in ground taken and lives saved. The second phase is the war of memory, fought with archives and advocacy, where victory is measured in historical truth and moral acknowledgement. These men, through the tireless efforts of their families and supporters, eventually won both wars. Their victory in the war of memory is the ultimate triumph over the injustice that sought to erase them. It proves that a lie, however powerfully endorsed by the state, cannot outlive a truth that is defended by the loyalty of the few. Their story is a potent charge to the modern military, and indeed to any large institution that prizes its own image over its people. The Marine Corps today is stronger, more capable, and more faithful to its own motto because it finally embraced the truth of the 7th Battalion. The lesson is simple and enduring. Redemption is possible, but it requires repentance. It requires the courage to admit the historical wrong, to stop defending the flaws of the past, and to fully embrace the heroism that was once rejected. For the modern soldier, especially the Black American Marine, the 7th Defense Battalion provides a foundational legacy that is non-negotiable. The modern Marine stands on the shoulders of men who were deemed safe enough to be ignored, but who fought with the ferocity of the most elite commandos. This legacy demands not just respect, but continuation. It is a challenge to maintain the excellence that made the cover-up so painful in the first place, ensuring that competence is the only currency that defines their worth. Ultimately, the men of the 7th Defense Battalion gifted us a profound truth about the human spirit. They were tested by the fire of the enemy, the fury of nature, and the cold indifference of their own command. They endured all three. They proved that the deepest strength is found not in avoiding hardship, but in transforming it. They took the insult of their segregated role and turned it into a supreme act of military professionalism. They were the men who, when left to die in the mud and the dark, chose to build a fortress of defiance with their own bodies. The silence that surrounded the jungle ambush is over. The forgotten battle is now a permanent chapter in the annals of American courage. The 7th Defense Battalion will no longer be remembered as a footnote, but as a foundational pillar of the integrated Marine Corps, a testament to the fierce, unyielding power of loyalty, truth, and the absolute refusal to surrender one's own dignity, even when the fight must be waged against the very uniform you wear. The final charge is to us, the living. We know their truth. We know the price they paid. We have retrieved their memory from the mud and the silence. It is now our duty to ensure that the light of their courage shines so brightly that no shadow of prejudice can ever again darken the heroic history of the United States Marine Corps. They have done their part. We must now ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain.